So my name is Isabel Parasram and I'm the trustee of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, which is kindly co-hosting this webinar alongside the Chinese Lib Dems. So I'd just like to say a warm welcome to everyone who is attending today. And on the screen, you can now see the various people who are participating today. We have Mrs. Linda Chung, who is the chair of the Camden Chinese Community Association. And we've got Dr. George Lee, who is a former chief inspector with the Metropolitan Police. And what we're going to be discussing today is the impact of COVID-19 and the consequent ramifications of hate crime, particularly against the Chinese community and also people who are perceived to be Chinese. And we've got a brilliant session lined up. What I wanted to forewarn you about is that the session is being recorded and participants are not currently live. We can't see you on video, but we can hear you if you wish to ask a question and ask it out loud. So what I would say is if you look in the bottom at the middle, there's a chat section. And if you click that and type your question in and alongside that indicate whether you would like to ask your question live or make a comment live, that would be fantastic. We're really keen to hear from you as members of the audience as well. And the way that this is going to proceed is that we are aiming to finish at 1 o'clock because we're aware that many people have obligations during this lockdown, even busier so for some people. And we're going to have our speakers speak for roughly 10 to 15 minutes each, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. So at the point at which I move on to the Q&A, at that point you can stay or go. As I said, this is being recorded, so hopefully you'll have the chance to have a look at it later on or share it with your friends. Chris Gleadle has disappeared. He is the CEO of the Paddy Ashdown Forum and is the person who works behind the scenes to make sure everything happens with super efficiency, and he leads our organisation brilliantly well. So I just wanted to say thank you to him as he disappeared, and Lauren, who has been supporting us in setting this up. So without further ado, let's move on and begin. So Dr. George Lee, would you like to go ahead? I know that you've got some slides to show us, so I'm really looking forward to what you have to say.
Right. Do you want us to do a quick personal intro as well first?
That would be fantastic.
Okay, great.
So much more to you than I have said.
Okay. So yes, George Lee was the first Chinese to join the military defence as a civil servant, and the first Chinese to join the Met Police. I was founded the Black Police Association. After the police, I had a career in the private sector, so as managing partner for Mercer, Oliver Wyman Consulting. I was Senior Vice President at T-Mobile International, MD at Logica and Wipro. I'm now the managing partner for Chaucer, looking after our government sector. And I did a PhD at Cambridge on international development, mainly about China. So what I'm going to talk about is very much around, I'm going to share my screen, more to do with China, the Chinese in Britain, and the history of kind of discrimination, if you like. Obviously, COVID-19, I think, is just one of those episodes that have brought some of the historical discrimination against Chinese to the fore. The Chinese have been in the UK since the 1800s. Most came as seafarers, and then they kind of assimilated into the host community. More Chinese came in the 50s and 60s from Hong Kong, mainly Cantonese and Hakka, of my parents, for example, and they couldn't speak English, and therefore many of them went into takeaways and restaurants. And then in the 70s, you had the Vietnamese boat people who were ethnic Chinese, most of them, and they too kind of assimilated into the existing Chinese community and went into the catering trade. Then in the 70s and 80s, you had more kind of student and professionals from Malaysia and Singapore who came to the UK, but they didn't really integrate with the existing Chinese community from Hong Kong and Vietnam. And then obviously in the 90s, with the handover of Hong Kong, more professional and ex-civil servants from Hong Kong came over. And again, they didn't really integrate with the existing Chinese community that was here. And then mainland Chinese started to come in, obviously, after the Tiananmen Square massacre with the asylum seekers, and present day with the economic rise of China, a lot of the Chinese have come over to study and open business there. So there's about 100,000 Chinese students in our universities. So in terms of history, the whole idea of yellow peril started in the US. The Chinese were the only race of people in the US and in the UK where legislation was passed against them. So the Chinese who actually built the railroad and did all the work in the gold industry, mining, were not allowed to become US citizens, and specifically mainly Chinese. And it's interesting, even in the interwar years, the Chinese were seen as either mafias or druggies or even communists. If you look at the cartoon to the right, you'll see even though China wasn't a communist state at that time, the whole idea of fear of communism in China was still quite large. In terms of in Europe, if you look at this particular painting of a German Kaiser who saw himself as the lead with all the Western Europeans who are depicted as females against the yellow horde. So in Europe there was also a anti-Chinese feeling, and then really the whole thing depicted, and I think it's still quite true today, the kind of Mongolian octopus. So it depicts the Chinese as people who avoid paying taxes, who like to gamble, who are actually into drugs like the opium, which is actually quite ironic, bearing in mind it was the British who forced the Chinese to take opium, and the Chinese fought 2 wars against it. The Chinese, again, very eminent to today, were seen as people who brought diseases, so smallpox, immorality, and also to the top right. And I think, again, with the COVID development and the kind of Sino-US trade war, the whole idea of China taking the world in terms of cheap labor and becoming an economic power have all been kind of fears in the Western psyche since the 1800s. And then very quickly moved on. There's been a few articles in The Guardian in the past talking about xenophobia. And if you look at the whole idea, kind of whole yellow peril idea, it's the antecedents of it. If you look at this particular research on this page that I've highlighted, shows you that actually it's been there ever since, in terms in our main media, in theatres, in cinemas. So the Fu Manchu image is still writ large in people's psyche about the Chinese being inscrutable. You don't quite understand what they're thinking, and these people are basically rivals. And I guess it's a fear about the Chinese in the Western psyche. It's kind of discrimination in reverse, in that the Chinese are seen as usually very clever, very successful, very hardworking. Those traits are seen as, if you like, competition to the West, and therefore the Chinese are somehow seen as more of a threat to Western civilization than other race. And it's interesting, a couple of academics, Benjamin Gomez, who research in this field, said the Chinese, who in modern times have been the target of special exclusion laws in all 5 continents, the near universality of anti-Chinese prejudice was a most favored nation policy in reverse. So actually, as I said, Chinese was the only race that actually had lots of legislation that was written against them. So even today, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, the Chinese are discriminated against. Not that, for example, in Indonesia, they can't use their Chinese names. They have to have partners in their business. And there's a positive discrimination in reverse, in that the Chinese don't have access to state education. A lot of them go to private universities, for example. Hence, you get a lot of Malaysian Chinese outside of Malaysia studying in the UK. So the whole kind of idea that, so in one respect, I think globally, and the COVID, we'll probably talk more about this later, this whole xenophobia, I fear, is that with the growing trade war with the US, it's a new Cold War, and the xenophobia, I believe, is going to be here for a long time. And finally, if you think about, even in this country, so during the Morecambe Bay tragedy, where a number of Chinese workers were drowned, you had an MP, Anne Winterton, who actually made a joke that the sharks were bored with eating tuna, so they went to Morecambe Bay for a Chinese instead. And you have terms like, the C word being used quite widely still in certain parts of our society. And even in 2015 general election, obviously Nigel Farage said that the C word is a widely used term when one of his candidates actually used that term. And so that kind of words that, if you like, the N word and the P word is not allowed to be used in the UK, and people are more kind of sensitive to that, but the C word is less so, and in terms that it's still widely used. And as we all know, you know, even Prince Philip used the term slitty eyes to describe the Chinese. So I think reminiscent of what's happening today with COVID, foot and mouth outbreak, for example, the Chinese, even though there's nothing to do with Chinese, were blamed for that outbreak and the spread of that, and that actually affected the Chinese businesses all around the country, actually, where the media and social media were talking about Chinese using cats and dogs and their meat and things, which is, we all know, is totally untrue. So I think, as we've seen in recent times, in this country, the COVID-19 has led to increase in hate crime against the Chinese, and I fear that will carry on once the lockdown is over. And I think it's incumbent on us as Liberals to actually highlight this issue, to actually lobby government, politicians, and the media to make sure that they actually put in a tolerant tone, not to actually stoke the fear of the Chinese community, because anything to talk about xenophobia, particularly if you look at the cartoon there, which again I think it's quite today in terms of the whole fear of China taking over the world with COVID-19, that the economy is now coming back up and they're going to buy everything up. That is still fear in many, particularly right-wing politicians' rhetoric, and I think that is something that we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
George, thank you so much. That was so much information in a really short space of time, but so very well presented. And I have learned an incredible amount from what you've just said. I'm sure that other people feel the same. I have got so many questions that I want to ask, but I'm going to wait. We've just had Jonathan Fryer saying, brilliant presentation, George, thank you. So I think that reflects the way that we all feel. I'm going to give the floor to the Q&A and people who want to ask questions later, so I will resist from asking questions. Please, everybody, if you have questions or even a comment, put it into the chat and indicate whether you'd like me to read it out or you would like to ask your question yourself. So we'll now move on to Linda, and I know that you have a slightly different angle that you'll be taking, but we're really looking forward to hearing quite what that is.
Isabel, can everyone hear me? Excellent.
We can hear you loud and clear. And see you in all your glory.
I think my laptop keeps fading, so wave to me if I disappear. I'm Linda Chung. I'm a former Liberal Democrat councillor at Camden Council. Everyone was delighted when I was elected because I was the first Chinese woman to be on Camden Council. Thank you, George. Thank you to you, Isabel. Thank you to the European Liberal Forum and the opportunity to debate these issues. It's an honour to talk here at the forum in the name of Paddy Ashdown, who was a patron of the Chinese Liberal Democrats. Paddy was a great hero, a great figure for social justice, and I suspect he would be raging at the idea of racism and racist attacks against British Chinese. Definitions. When I talk about hate incidents targeted at British people because of COVID-19, I mean all of us who can be loosely said to look Chinese, to include people of East and Southeast Asia. The racists can't and don't differentiate. Do also bear in mind that I talk about recent racist hate attacks against Chinese people. I also fully rail against racism in all its forms, against all minorities, because of the way we look, because of the way we are perceived, and that we are perceived to be different. I focus on the Chinese community because COVID-19 has brought out the full glory of racism against a community that is traditionally quiet and inexperienced in dealing with racism compared to other ethnic minority communities. I want to acknowledge and thank all the NHS doctors, nurses and care teams who have worked tirelessly to save lives at risk to their own. It's painful that in the light of this human commitment, the subject of racism even arises. In fact, many British people wouldn't believe it. It is simply not British, and surely not against the quiet and well-behaved Chinese. So we have an attitude of denial, and that includes ignorance, because we don't care or want to know what Chinese communities have to face, some on a daily basis. I want to share some thoughts and recommendations as to what can be done. Worse than the attitude of denial is the attitude of acceptance. It's teasing, we are told, when children are mimicked in the playground, or pushed around, or catcalled. Don't be so sensitive, even my partner told me. All kids have to endure some form of teasing, we are told. The boy who has red hair, the child who is too tall, too small, looks different. But when does teasing and jokes turned into bullying and abuse? It's wrong to say a bit of rough treatment toughens kids to prepare them for official times further along the line. It does not. Some kids manage to cope, but deep down there lies a degree of trauma. Read the psychology journals. The pandemic has increased the abuse not only of children, but all men and women, old and young, as long as they look Chinese. They are easy targets to blame. If it's not the pandemic, racists shout slurs about all sorts of nonsense and talk about the yellow peril, as George has said. The crisis has brought out not only the sly racist cowards who daub obscene graffiti on Chinese takeaways, but the biggest of the brutes who physically attack students and even the elderly who can't fight back. What to do? I start with education in university and support for students at these universities. Children need to be taught by parents and teachers the values of tolerance and respect for other children. It's too easy to say that, of course we do that, but it's following it through. The understanding of other cultures besides their own would enrich all lives. An amount of focus on Britain's colonial history, as George has said, would help understanding of some of the roots of racism against the Chinese and other minorities. Teachers and parents need to be on the lookout for bullying. They are the guardians of a child's well-being and safety. There should be clear guidelines so that a bullied child is confident in reporting that they will receive protection and something will be done to stop their perpetrators. Universities now have recognized the prevalence of hate crimes against Chinese students. Many show good practice in setting up good reporting and support systems. Such practices should become a norm in teaching establishments. Local authorities, again, there should be clear advice as to how victims can get support if they are racially harassed in any way in their daily lives. They should be appointed to local councillors who are able to take up their cases. Ultimately, if incidents persist, the police can take action. The effect of the press and media, there is no doubt that the press and media have inflamed matters. From TV personalities who think they are clever and funny, to those who simply stick to stereotypes, too lazy to check any facts, to the tabloids that like a bit of scandal and sensationalism, that go for easy targets, that continue to perpetuate images of Chinese inherited from the colonial era. They treat They tread a fine line when they use images of Chinese faces, whether they are relevant or not, whenever they report on the pandemic, ingraining the images so that it can be seen. They are to blame, however ludicrous that is. The Lord Leveson report, released in 2012, said that the politicians and press have become too close. The press are capable of behaving, quote, outrageously. No wonder there's such a low level of trust in by the public, never mind by the ethnic minorities. The attitudes of the police. The Chinese community are the greatest respecters of the police, but sad to say, in the past, that respect has not been reciprocated. It dawned on us that following the tragic case of Stephen Lawrence, the judgment of Sir William Macpherson in 1999, that the police were institutionally racist was correct, but we can never put a finger on it before. It wasn't just individuals, but the whole institution, when reports of racist hate crimes were simply ignored, such that the community gave up reporting. Thankfully, things have changed considerably since then, due to some fantastic work by pioneers in race equality. Let me mention the work done by the MPS, the Metropolitan Police Service, of which I have direct experience at the moment. They have established a unit to cover all aspects of policing related to COVID-19, which includes race hate crime. This means that each of the 12 Met Command units has its own hate crime coordinator. This inclusion and engagement unit has encouraged the work of the Met Police Chinese and Southeast Asian Staff Association, who have helped to create videos in various languages, including Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Thai, to empower those communities to have confidence in reporting. This is laudable, but there's a long way to go before the police do gain that essential trust and confidence from the Chinese when they experience race hate crime, particularly at this time of reduced police funding, closed police stations, and reduced police visibility. One woman who has young children and who has experienced verbal abuse and continual attacks of vandalism at her takeaway premises dare not take matters further because she fears retribution from her attackers, and the police will do nothing. I think the biggest step to improve public confidence will be that the police will take racist crime seriously, have more assiduous investigations, and show some successful prosecutions of cases. What can the Chinese community do to help itself? I was very surprised when a very educated and distinguished senior judge with whom I used to work called us insular. I protested. Surely it was he who was insular and made no effort to understand us. We were both right. The Chinese have traditionally been reserved, and the general populace have considered us as insignificant, not worth bothering with, exacerbated by barriers of language. Unlike other ethnic minorities, such as Black, British, and Indian communities, we are less experienced in joining in public life, in the political sphere, and in campaigning against racial discrimination. But things are changing. The Chinese have realized that politics affect our daily lives, and membership of the Chinese Liberal Democrats, Chinese for Labour, and Chinese Friends of the Conservatives continue at a steady pace. We now have 2 Chinese MPs, and there are a dozen or so Chinese councillors. To continue to make a difference, the Chinese community campaigns against injustices, for example, must continue. For example, against the behaviour of the police and the UK Border Agency in the heavy-handed raids on Chinese restaurants in Soho in July 2018. It was totally remarkable that all business owners and workers collectively closed down their shops and businesses and restaurants, and together with hundreds of demonstrators marched to the Home Office to hand over a petition. Now comes the formation of CARG, the COVID anti-racism group, of which I am a member, where a group of Chinese activists want to alert and want to raise awareness of tackling rising racism. Angered by the ignorance and biased reporting of the press and media, we encourage members and supporters who feel that if the report or method of reporting is racially biased, to complain to the publication and to the Independent Press Standards Organisation. The same with Ofcon, which deals with complaints against TV and radio broadcasting. As regards Ofcon, this is such a elephantine organisation that covers the whole of the communications industry that one wonders whether any complaints by individuals ever get through. And this is where CAR will hope to make a difference in lobbying those groups. The biggest challenge of all is that we show the right way to behave during this unprecedented time, that we work with mutual cooperation. As George has said, this is not the case with some of our main political leaders at the moment. So we get back to small community action, united action by the community, make sure that we elect leaders that we can trust, and hope to fight this awful pandemic and to help people realise that we need, that racism is simply not acceptable. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Linda. And what really struck me about what you said was how you were so inclusive in your language, and so you weren't just focusing on the racism that the Chinese community has experienced, but you've also incorporated all of the other forms of racism that we are experiencing across society. And you've given a plug to other political parties. So, you know, the issue here is that we need to work cross-party on these issues, and we cannot be siloed. And that is the entire ethos that I have had from those I've worked with within the Chinese community, which has really struck me, which is why I wanted to highlight that. So thank you very much, Linda. And we've already had a comment saying, thank you, Linda, for such great insight. A question has been asked that I will put to George first and then Linda. So a couple of minutes to just respond. It's more a comment. And the comment is that it is time to move away from emphasis on racism towards Chinese to racism towards East Asians. Racists target victims by their appearance and not by their nationality. And the experience of Black communities, Asian communities in combating race crimes shows that we need to speak in one voice, because appearance identity is a lesson that we should learn from. And I know, to be fair to you both, that that is something that you have already expressed to me, that it's not just about race in particular, it's about appearance and the perception of what particular category of ethnic group you might belong to. So I'd just like you to have the chance to address that. George, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, of course. I think, you know, yes, I see that, but I think having been a policeman on the street, what I see is that when whether you know, East Asian, Southeast Asian like it or not, when they see Chinese-looking features, most racists think you're Chinese. You know, the whole kind of the thing. So, and I think it links to what's said. The whole yellow peril fear is about Chinophobia. It's always historically focused about China. So I accept on the ground we need to tackle racism, whatever shape and form, and against whatever race. But I think the whole kind of dialogue and the whole kind of language around the fear of China and criticism of China has a direct impact on the Chinese community in the UK, because it's no other race really. So if you criticize Vietnam, a lot of people are not going to pick out Vietnamese who are living in the UK to say, you're all the same. There is that link. It's like, I don't know why, but in the West, there's this view that if you're Chinese, you're somehow loyal to China, which is very different from other forms of racism. If you're a Jamaican, a black Jamaican, you get discriminated against. People are not going to link you. Oh, he's always loyal to Jamaica. So there's that things that I don't know the answer to, but certainly that's what I've seen in hidden. And I think from looking at history, that has always been part of the kind of psyche of the West. And certainly all the campaigns and legislation I mentioned, in this country, we had the whole Keep Our Colonies White campaign, which was basically to keep the Chinese out, even though these colonies, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada had indigenous locals there already, and people who were not white. In actual fact, a lot of these places welcome Indian people from Asia, because they saw them as part of the colony, whereas the Chinese never, even though Hong Kong was a colony, was never seen as part of the British colony, as it were, or family. So I think that there is that element to it that we need to recognise.
Thanks for that insight, George. Linda?
I totally agree with the questioner. And this is why CARG, the COVID-19 anti-racism group, specifically, as in its title, that it includes East Asians and Southeast Asians. As George says, we're targeted by appearance. For example, the Filipino communities are comparatively small. What is nice about the Southeast Asian staff group that I've mentioned is that it is actually police officers that have created those videos in these different languages. And again, going back to being inclusive, I think one of the biggest things that we can achieve is that more people are in the professions like the police, more visible in other roles, rather than being either totally professional, as in lawyers, dentists, but also being working in the restaurants, people who take part. But the visibility of all of us that look Chinese are visible in the community and not simply stereotypes. It is so hard to say the mouthful of East and Southeast Asian communities, but as I say, the aim of the work of CARG is to tackle racism against all of those. And apologies that we keep saying just Chinese, it's just that it's so much of a mouthful saying the rest.
Thank you very much, Linda. One of the things that we as Liberal Democrats did, our press office submitted FOI requests in relation to hate crimes, and what was really interesting is if you have a look on Sky, on Google, Sky News as a result, I'm just looking at my phone, so apologies for that, revealed at least 267 hate crimes recorded against Chinese people between January and March during the COVID-19 crisis. And what's particularly of interest to me as a barrister is that the rate of offences in the first 3 months of 2020 was nearly 3 times that of the previous 2 years. So there is very much something significant in what George has said, but I understand what Linda is saying in the wider context, and it's very helpful to have both those perspectives, so thank you. I think that leads nicely to a question that's been asked by a participant, and I'm not going to mention names just for confidentiality reasons. If you would like your name mentioned, then please let me know. But there's a question that I've been asked to ask that really has some link to what you've been saying already, and I'll go to Linda first. And that is, a tricky area for overseas Chinese to navigate is being labelled as either pro or anti-China. We can take a more intelligent position, We are not mouthpieces of CCP, nor necessarily China bashers. What position do you think that we should take as liberals, as non-liberals, because we may have non-liberals attending this webinar? So, Linda, would you like to comment?
I would like to think that all our community are liberal with a small l. We're having this debate because we are liberal in that we're thinking and we want a more tolerant society. It's always a problem when in situations, I mean, I organised an event once which took people to the Chinese Embassy Cultural Centre, and this was a group of a very senior hospital admin executives, and they were rather doubtful about visiting this Chinese Embassy Cultural Centre, and it was an invitation from the Chinese Embassy because we could be seen as pro-communist China. Now, some of the doctors in that group thankfully said, oh, for goodness sake, we're going to be making a trip to China. We're going to be visiting some of their hospitals. We ought to go and regard it as a form of prep and learning exercise to learn about China. So I think we've got to understand that every individual and some groups have their own loyalties, and we've got to understand why they have those loyalties. You asked me to take a personal position, and I think mine is probably very similar to many Chinese who have been brought up and educated here. We think Britain is a wonderful country. We think the British are wonderful people, but inside our souls, we have a degree of Chinese culture of which we are also proud. That does not mean we side with any country or any country's acts that we do not agree with, but we can't and we should not be labelled as being that or the other.
Thank you for that, Linda. George, you looked so deep in thought. I'm really interested in what it is you've got to say.
Well, it's just such a complex question, isn't it? I think we need to divide up. I look at this country, we're 17 million people, and we're all very different, and we all have very different political beliefs. And it's unfair for us to think that all Chinese, when we talk about China, are all communists and they all support the communists. There's 1.5 billion people in China. It's a very diverse country, and they're all individuals. And I think, if you ask the Chinese whether they love China, I think, overseas Chinese, of course they love China. Are they all CCP members? No, of course they're not CCP members. And do they all agree with everything the CCP does? No, I'm sure they don't. And I'm sure they want more kind of personal freedom and access to the internet or Facebook or what have you. Certainly, I think particularly younger generation. But actually, if you then ask them, what would you change? Yeah, okay, you change that, but they still want stability. They still want economic growth. They still want to live their life. They still want to send their kids to good schools. And, if you look at the turmoil of China in the past, it's only a very small bit in the interwar years where it was a republic. And then even in that republic was chaos and it's full of corruption because the KMT, who then went to Taiwan, was not there for the people. It was there for themselves. And whatever we think of the communists, they've done some terrible things. They mismanaged the economy in the Great Leap Forward. They, had purges during the Cultural Revolution, but they have, in recent years, lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty, and there is no dignity in poverty. I can speak that from personal experience. Somebody who was brought up in a shanty town, worked in a toy factory at age 5. So actually, you ask many Chinese, they're very grateful to the communists and actually what they've given them. What is life about? It's about, being able to live your life with some degree of dignity. Yes, I think people want more political freedom, but I don't think overseas Chinese should be fearful of speaking up what they believe in. And even in this country, we are not great at what we do. We live in a democracy, but we have lots of scandals. I mean, look at the way we're running COVID. Look at the Windrush scandal. Look at the fact that, we're saying, oh, the Chinese have been hiding their numbers. They're not accurate. But we've had problem getting our numbers from care homes and making the death toll count. So a lot of it isn't some sort of conspiracy. A lot of it is potentially incompetence, So I don't think we should, we shouldn't see this China as a monolithic kind of one thing. Because that just plays into the whole yellow peril view of the world, that we're all the same.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, because I'm getting back. You can hear me. Good. So George and Linda, just be aware that towards the end, I may, if we have time, just ask you for one takeaway that you would want us to bear in mind once the webinar is over. So if we have time, I'll be doing that. But I would like now, Chris, if you could fiddle with the buttons that need to be pressed so that we can go to Daniel York Lowe, who has a comment. And Daniel, if you could make it as brief as possible, that would be great.
Oh, yeah. Hello.
Daniel, you are live.
You can hear me, yeah. No, I mean, I absolutely agree with what George and Linda are saying about the whole thing about Chinese not being a monolithic thing and not necessarily being associated with the government of China. The problem is, though, I think that term Chinese is so hopelessly weaponized and racialized by both Western powers and the Chinese government. I mean, and it's a very, I find it a very culturally exclusive term. And I'm talking about, so I am of Chinese descent. I'm half Chinese, but being half Chinese, I don't know. I find it a difficult word, and I think it's an exclusive word, and I think we should come together more as diverse East and Southeast Asians. I mean, the term China is, I mean, the concept of China is a mythological creation in many ways. I mean, we've never called China, except by Westerners, until about 100 years ago. And now it becomes this thing where it's simultaneously a country and it's simultaneously a race. And then I just think it causes so much, I think it divides us. I think it creates a racial hierarchy. As soon as you say Chinese and other East Asians, you're kind of making another box, which is never good. So I just wanted to put that there, that I think it's far better, I think, to embrace our diversity. And the fact that, yes, everybody, I mean, all East and Southeast Asians are copying this kind of racism at the moment.
Linda or George, which of you would like to comment?
Daniel, good to talk to you. I follow you on Twitter, so it's lovely to hear your voice. Daniel, again, I totally understand what you're saying. And in fact, I quickly read up on various issues as to various ways that we can be labelled, whether we're Chinese, Malaysian, Singaporean, etc., Thai, Vietnamese, etc., etc. And it was very interesting that in the Lib Dem report about what went wrong, that the Lib Dem do about the last election, that they still, or well, I shouldn't say they still, because it's what everybody does, label the ethnic minorities as BAME, black and ethnic minorities, or black and minority ethnic. And I was very interested to read an article by Stephen Bush, of a prominent journalist. We said, well, I don't want to be called a BAME, or why are they still calling, lumping BAME together? Call them Chinese, call them Malaysian, call them Philippines, etc., etc. So in a way, we've got to change the psyche, do our best, because it's not going to be easy, because people like names or words that roll off the tongue and lump us all together. But I agree, we do find a way that's more inclusive of any community that's being targeted for any particular reason. In this case, racism, because we all look alike.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, the fact is, what is Britishness? What does British mean? To hold the idea of identity, it's a very complex personal thing, if I'm honest, and it becomes very academic in some respects. But I personally, my take on it is be yourself. I'm Chinese, my wife is English, but I look Chinese, but actually I'm very British in every way. And the only thing about Chinese about me is that I like Chinese food. So it's, at the end of the day, you can't help how the people see you, but if you're self-confident and know how you want to live your life and know what you stand for, then I don't think that identity is how people label you is a problem in my books.
Daniel, that was a fantastic contribution. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. I'm going to skip to another comment because somebody's just inserted a comment in relation to something that you said. So Lauren, would you like to give David the floor, please?
Hello.
Hi, David.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, in 2015, during the kind of whole Brexit campaign, in the lead up to, there was a lot of anti-immigrant and racist language being used, particularly by UKIP and the likes of Nigel Farage and so on, who said the use of the C word was common parlance amongst British people. As a result, the BBC did a national survey of young British-born Chinese. And I remember being very shocked at hearing the stories that a lot of young people were recounting, particularly those who still worked in catering for whatever reason, because their parents were. And a lot of people were talking about racist attacks. One young lady described stones being thrown, tarmac being thrown at their shop window, her mother being kicked unconscious by a gang. This was up in the northeast of England. And all these 20-year-olds, British-born Chinese, were all saying that they just didn't trust the police because they'd reported these incidents, and most of these incidents they felt they were ignored. I've put a link in the question Q&A thing if people can see that, but you can click on that link and you can read these stories for yourselves. So it was fantastic hearing Linda talking about how the Met Police at the moment is a kind of fantastic example of really listening to our communities. And I'm part of that weekly Met conference call. So I know that they're really a brilliant force for setting a good example for best practice. But how can we ensure that all the other regional police forces are doing the same thing? How can we ensure that they are really listening? Because obviously if these levels of appalling racism was 5 years ago, things undoubtedly are far worse now because of the COVID-19 xenophobia that's around. So how can we, how can the police nationally guarantee that they're really listening to all these hate crime problems and kind of ensure that our community is safe across the UK?
David, thank you very much for that very insightful question. I have a little comment, which is that this is not necessarily purely about police forces. It's about communities and all of us taking action in the spheres in which we have influence. And I do think it's important to talk about police forces, so we're going to go to that in just a second. But one of the things I've done as Vice President of the Liberal Democrats is to have written a letter to the Home Secretary highlighting this issue alongside Christine Jardine MP, Daisy Cooper MP. And part of this, I think, is public awareness. And for those who are on this call, we're all aware of what is happening, but you would be so surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, at the number of people who are not aware of what is happening. And so that's just something that I would throw in there. But I will go to George, probably because you're very well experienced in this sphere. So George first.
Yes, I think if we think about kind of diversion, education, enforcement, prevention, I think you have to tackle it in a holistic kind of way. Police only do mainly enforcement, and I think quite rightly, you know, we have written to the Home Secretary, and it has to come from the top. We also have to lobby the media in terms of getting to change the tone, and obviously, as you know, I personally lobbied Martin Hewitt, who's the chair of the National Police Chief Council, who promised me that he will make sure that the various police forces would do their bit. But, you know, obviously it should come from the top, from the Home Secretary, and better still from the Prime Minister making a comment about this. And I think also, as we all know, right, that Brexit has opened a Pandora's box in terms of racism. And actually, I think, you know, it's put this country back 20 years from where we were. I mean, when I was in the police in the 80s and 90s, racism was rife. And when I was, you know, and I think, David, I personally experienced what you said there, because when I was a cop, a lot of policemen think a Chinese victim, let's just leave them to it, particularly if the perpetrator was Chinese, because they just think, well, that they're, you know, it's an infighting thing, it must be a triad-related thing, therefore we shouldn't get involved. So there's still, I'm afraid, some of that attitude in there, because these police officers who were, you know, constables in the 80s and 90s are now senior police officers. So, you know, that don't change the spot. And then in terms of kind of education, we just need to widen these debates. Like this helps, because we need to, the population generally need to understand some of these issues, and police officers are drawn from wider society. If society is racist and has a certain stereotype and prejudice, they're going to carry that into their job, unfortunately. But then, as I said, training would get some of that out, but education would get some of that out. But it has to start with a bigger picture.
Thank you for that, George. Linda, do you want to add a comment?
Yes, David, I think I just want to look at two aspects of it. One that I've mentioned, that the Chinese community need to get more involved in public life. I myself are on a couple of local police groups. We feed back to the police as to what's going on. I'm very pleased that the work that the Met is doing, and I've asked that good practice should make each other aware. That's distributing to the regions, and I think that's happening, aspects of this good practice. But it is also to do with the Chinese community having confidence to challenge. In all spheres of life, I think we must and we need to get our community to understand that they do have a voice, and to challenge all aspects of unfairness, discrimination, racism against everyone. It's an evil, and we need to speak out. And we can work with the people in authority, like the police, but as Isabel says, is having joined up thinking about all the people and bodies in authority, from the press to education, etc., etc.
I think education is key, because there's actually been a 900% increase in anti-Chinese sentiment on Twitter, for example, and a 900% increase that was reported by a company called Light. And there's also been a 70% increase in cyberbullying amongst young people, again reported by Light. So I think, you know, education is key, but I think, you know, there's only so much that those of us who are involved in carg.info can do. You know, one can spend days and days on the internet reporting racist comments and so on, but actually it's exhausting, but you know, spending all this time to report to the various platforms, it should actually be the tech companies themselves that should be proactively taking action to stop hate speech.
David, can I follow up on that? Again, focusing on the police, I mean, cybercrime, cyberbullying, etc., etc. I think this is one of the things that the police, and they're so short of resources, should be talking about to stop all this stuff on the internet that is so hateful and so useful to the racists, that just inflame racist passions. Now, so that's the aspect of the police. But the other thing is, thank you for the plug for CARG Info, because that is only the beginning of our work. We're a committee of 7 at the moment, and we're carrying all the work. I would like to be able to recruit some professional people who know different aspects and are experienced in different aspects of what they do, who think they can contribute, and to join us and to support us in improving the depth, quality and sphere of our work.
Thank you, everyone. That was a brilliant mini debate there. And for those who have commented in terms of websites we can refer to, it'd be really helpful if you could put the link, if you could put that into the chat. That would be really useful, perhaps for the Chinese Lib Dems, CARG, European Liberal Forum and the Paddy Ashdown Forum. That would be really fantastic, because I suspect this debate will continue, and if we can take this work forward by connecting with each other, all the merrier. I know that there have been so many comments in the chat, and also there's a Q&A section that some of us may have missed. Please do click onto that. There's an anonymous attendee who's asked a brilliant question about the various viruses and diseases that have broken out. We won't have time, unfortunately, to go to that. And Linda, you may know Peksan Tan, who says that, yeah, so they say they're a colleague of yours, and they had some brilliant points, quite a few, but unfortunately they've sent their apologies. They have to leave to be in another conference. So all of their comments are in the chat, and I'm so sorry I can't read all of them. One person has added that BAME stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic, so they wanted to clarify that. So I just wanted to appreciate all of the contributions that people have made. We've got literally a minute for you, Linda and George, to give us one takeaway, but before we do that, I'd just like to say thank you to the European Liberal Forum for helping us to manage the mechanics of this, and to the Paddy Ashdown Forum, of which I'm a trustee, for co-hosting it with the Chinese Lib Dems. And the most important thing is to say thank you to all of the participants who have made this such a brilliant event, not only from your contributions, but by the very fact that you're here. And please do share the news that this recording can be shared more widely if you would like to do that. So I'm going to pass on to George and to Linda for a 1 minute takeaway, at which point I will then close our session. So George, would you like to just share with us what you want us to take away from this?
I think thank you for everybody for joining, and thank you for organising today. I think my request is that let's not let just the Chinese and East Asian and Southeast Asian people fight this battle. And I think, you know, the broader church we have, and the more diverse group that we have to help speak up against this issue, the stronger we are.
Fantastic, George. Thank you very much. Linda?
I can only follow that with saying to George, I totally agree. And to every member of the Chinese, East Asian, Southeast Asian community, to all of us who have experienced racism, take courage. We can do something about it if we do it together.
Haven't we had a treat today of having two fantastic speakers? It's been such a serious subject, but you have provided it with a depth of intellect and compassion that has been really very, very heartwarming. So thank you both for being such fantastic speakers. A quick plug for what's coming next. The Paddy Ashdown Forum is hosting a webinar on ageism in the context of COVID-19, and we're also hosting a webinar which will feature a couple of medical experts to address any kind of myths versus facts on COVID-19. And I'm also working on a series on racism, gender inequality and economic inequality, and that will be through the Liberal Democrats. So stay tuned, and if you are somebody who might be a specialist or an expert who would like to participate by being a speaker or a participant, then please message me on social media. My tags us, Isabel Parasram. But in the meantime, I'm going to honour the fact that people are on their lunch breaks potentially, and I will close the meeting. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm seeing loads of messages coming up, so we'll hopefully save the chat and savour what you've had to say. But thank you very much, everyone, and hopefully we'll meet again virtually, if not in person, someday soon. Take care.